Okay, this is the audio review of The Invention of Heterosexuality from Race, Class, and Gender 10th edition. So when it comes to the invention of heterosexuality, we assume that heterosexuality has existed for as long as our species has existed. That heterosexuality is unchanging, universal, and ahistorical. While in reality, the idea of heterosexuality is a very modern invention, dating to the late 19th century. By not realizing how recent this notion is, analysts of sex have continued to privilege heterosexuality as normal and natural. When looking at this over history, we can see the definitions change, challenging the power of heteronormativity. So before heterosexuality, you had an era called the early Victorian true love from 1820 to 1860. During this time period, the ideal of true womanhood and true manhood revolved around purity or the freedom from sexual desires. Early Victorian true love was only for marriage. Sex was considered only for procreation, to create appropriately gendered children. The human body was thought of as a means towards procreation and production, as sexual pleasure was considered distasteful. Once you get to the late Victorian sex love era of 1860 to 1892, this is the time period where heterosexual lust becomes widely documented and named. During this time, several social factors caused an eroticizing of consciousness, of behavior, of emotion, and identity, such as the larger economic and structural changes that moved families from producers of goods to consumers of goods, which changed people's relationships with their own bodies. The growth of the consumer economy promoted a new pleasure ethic. Before this, people were supposed to refrain from things instead of indulging in them. During the same time period, the rise in prestige and influence of the medical discipline fostered a need to define what was normal sexually, and the term homosexual eventually came out of this discourse. So moving on to heterosexuality, the first years from 1892 to 1900. So the original definition of heterosexuality was actually constructed as deviant, meaning a person who wants to have sex for non-procreative purposes. The earliest use of the term homosexual happened in 1892, as people whose general mental state is that of the opposite sex. Later research typified it as an attraction to the same sex. The theory argued that the natural inborn sexual drive motivates us to produce offspring. This new category, heterosexual, created a new norm that came to dominate our idea of the sexual universe, changing it from a mode of reproduction to sexual pleasure. Moving on to the distribution of heterosexual mystique from 1900 to 1930. During this time, the opposite construction of the sexes were presented as the basis for normal erotic attraction between males and females. The stress on duality came from the earlier Victorian era and its ideals of true womanhood and true manhood. These ideas reflected the changing nature of society and deep anxieties that came from shifting work and social roles of men and women. Part of this norm related to sexuality as well, and started to see a woman as also having sexual drives, which undermined the Victorian idea of the true woman. So once you get to 1930, the heterosexual steps out. During this time, the word heterosexual makes its way into the larger media, such as the New York Times, becomes more normalized in the culture. Once you hit 1945, we have the heterosexual hegemony. The cult of domesticity following World War II reassociated women with the home, motherhood, and childcare. This is the period where heterosexuality became hegemonic, or the dominant system. Kinsey's research came out at this time, questioning what was considered normal by presenting sexuality as something on a continuum. This caused quite a shakeup as his research became widely known. Once we get to 1965, we have heterosexuality questioned. So this was the time of social change and challenging norms, which also extended to sexuality. It's in this time period that movements were formed and struggles were made for inclusion and rights in the dominant heterosexual society. So I think it's an important takeaway from this reading to point out how heterosexuality isn't unchanging, universal, or ahistorical. It is also socially constructed. And this article does a great job of pointing out how heterosexuality was socially constructed. And the fact that heterosexuality is really a modern invention, going back to the 19th century. When we understand this, how it was socially constructed, and really how it became the hegemony, we can then be able to kind of challenge the assumptions that underline this idea that it's been that norm forever.